African Development Bank. May the soul of the founder continue to rest in perfect peace. Your Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment. The award ceremony kicks off now. And the first award will be that of the outstanding.
Thank you. You may be seated. Your Excellency, Professor Yemi Osinbanjo, the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Mrs. Zainab Nda Isaya, Group Mr. Mike Opere Group, Vice Chairman, diplomats, distinguished guests, all protocols observed, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I feel very delighted to stand before you this morning in order to have a discussion with you about a subject that is of great importance to the peoples of Africa. I'm standing here in Nigeria, very much aware that out of every 5 working black men in the world, one of them is a Nigerian. So Nigeria, therefore, is the giant on our continent. And they say that when Nigeria coughs, the other part of Africa catch colds. So I'm honored to be speaking to you at this distinguished forum on a subject of credible elections and economies in transition. I was invited at this time. I don't know whether I was the right person to talk about this subject today, but I'm going to try my best not to disappoint. This discussion comes at a time we are grappling with this same matter back home in Kenya, following our last elections last year. Professor Makau has shared with you certain issues, but I don't want to go in that direction. Back home, I have expressed fears that if we do not comprehensively and credibly address the issue of credibility of this election outcome last year, the virus will spread and affect the upcoming elections on the continent. More immediately, Kenyans may lose all faith and decide to boycott the future elections because they will believe their votes do not matter. Kenya has become a laboratory for bad election practices that others borrow around the continent. You may recall that our malpractices of 2007 quickly became the script for Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Since then, more of our neighbors have followed suit and perfected the use of technology to override the will of the people, the voters. As a Pan-Africanist and as an Afro-optimist, I fully subscribe to and support Africa's Agenda 2063, which seeks the socio-economic transformation of the continent. And I'm also a student of late Kwame Nkrumah, who said that Africa must unite in order to progress. But I want to send a red flag at this forum. If Africa wants to achieve the goals of Agenda 2063, then we must prioritize and entrench free, fair, and credible elections by all member states. Since the reintroduction of multi-party politics in the 1990s, the quality and credibility of our elections have steadily deteriorated. You remember the struggle for democratization of the continent. From the independence in the 60s to the 70s, 80s, Africans were struggling because the period after independence, most multi-party systems were discarded and single-party dictatorships took root, followed by military coups that took place in the continent. The Africans were struggling to open up the democratic space. It was not until the fall of the Berlin Wall and that the wind of change that began to blow in the Eastern Europe fought its way into our continent. The military dictatorship then crumbled and the single-party dictatorships and gave way to multi-party elections. In many of our countries today, election management bodies have been captured by the ruling parties or individual politicians, making it impossible to have fair contests. The capture leads to skewed processes like voter registration, upon appointment of election management officials with disastrous consequences. As a continent, we have to agree that critical development efforts cannot succeed without a legitimate and democratically elected government that is responsive and accountable to its citizens and to the investor community. Free and fair elections are indicators to investors that there is the government which is in place that believes in fairness and the rule of law. When a government comes in through a fair ballot, investors get the reassurance that their property will be respected, taxation will be fair, investment rules will be simple and clear, and they will not have to resort to corruption and bribery to set up or stay in business. Illiberal regimes send signals that are direct opposite of what investors are looking for. Professor Mike touched on Boise State University in the US wrote, and I quote, "Many investors conclude that governments that violate electoral laws to stay in office would also be willing to violate investors' property rights. If the election was rigged and the leader is overriding laws and constitutional provisions, no one in the country can stand up to the government. And so investment falls because there's a lot of economic risk in doing business in countries with unconstrained governments," unquote. Regimes that come to power by rigged elections cannot guarantee judicial independence and other state and non-governmental bodies that are critical to the rule of law, which is an indispensable requirement for a good investment climate. We therefore need to internalize the fact that elections are important political risk assessment tools for investors. Investors look at how elections are being conducted before they can risk their investment in that environment. I must hasten to add here that by investors, I'm not simply talking about foreign investment. I refer also, most importantly, to domestic investors. Africa has seen swings in fortunes before, from bad to better and back to worse. Much, if not all of those swings, have resulted from elections that fail to meet the minimum standards for free elections. In other cases, there are no elections at all. In the mid-1990s, Africa was very hopeful following the introduction of multi-party politics on the continent. Our leaders and